Welcome to our podcast. My name is Raul Gomez. I am one of the editors of the Political Data Yearbook. And today we're discussing the Netherlands, or more precisely, the upcoming general election, which is due to take place on the 22nd of November. So I've got two fantastic experts here with me today. One is Leonie de Jonge, who is Assistant Professor in European Politics and Society at the University of Groningen. Welcome, Leonie.
Hello.
And our second guest is Simon Otjes, who is Senior Assistant Professor of Dutch Politics at Leiden University. Welcome, Simon.
Hello.
And so how can a political scientist sleep at night in the Netherlands? Because every single time that I take a peek at Dutch politics, things have completely changed.
Yeah, I mean, especially right now, things are really exciting for political scientists. Usually when elections happen, but we have been in a full year of elections with provincial elections at first, and now the general election, a snap election, which was called this summer. So it's been crazy, and all the incumbents, the leaders of the leading parties, of the coalition parties, have stepped down. So it's a really wide open playing field.
All right, so you've just mentioned that this is a snap election. So let's start by talking about that, why this election is taking place, right? So the Netherlands had an election a little bit over a couple of years ago, and then Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, decided to call a snap election now. Why?
Well, the election was formally called because the cabinet couldn't agree on the migration policy. So the Netherlands, like many European countries, has seen an influx of migration, in particular refugees in the last year. And the coalition was internally divided over how to deal with this. So on the one side, you have the conservative liberal VVD and the Christian Democratic CDA, who are more conservative on migration. And on the progressive side, you've got the social liberal D66 and the Christian Social ChristenUnie, which are more progressive on migration. And the coalition wanted to come to a migration deal, which on the one hand would limit the influx of migration, because that is something that the liberals really wanted. And in trade for that, there would be stronger rules on how municipalities would have to house refugees in order to prevent people from having to sleep outside, which has happened in the Netherlands in the previous summer. And so in order to address that issue, the government had to come basically with a big deal that both the left-wing, the more progressive parties had to agree with, and the more conservative parties had to agree with. And in the end, they couldn't come to an agreement. So that is sort of the key story of why the cabinet fell. But behind that, there's a longer story of how this coalition was formed, the unhappiness of all the parties in the coalition with it, and in particular, the looming threat of the nitrogen issue, actually. So a completely different political issue, which was going to derail the government probably after the summer. And the liberals, the conservative liberals, VVD, wanted to keep the focus on migration instead of this other issue. And that is why they strategically let the coalition fall on this issue.
So that's very interesting, because I was going to ask, is migration such an important issue that it was really the deciding factor in leading to this breakup of the coalition government? And you were suggesting that there were other issues involved, right?
So there are many other issues, but in the Netherlands, migration since 2002 has been a dominant issue in the political agenda, and one that also really structures the nature of competition. So that is the key issue where parties differ on, and where the right wants to really emphasize we are the ones that are going to restrict migration, and the parties on the more progressive side really want to say we want to defend the rights of refugees to come to the Netherlands. And so it is a very dominant issue in how Dutch political culture is structured now.
And maybe good to add that the migration situation it's not intuitive that is indeed why the government fell, because as Simon said, there are various other issues. And in fact, there were many scandals leading up in the run-up to this issue where you would have thought the government could fall, it might fall, but it didn't. So we have the saying Teflon mark, because our prime minister seems to be resistant to any sorts of scandals up until that moment. And then it did fall over this issue. And that suggests also that the VVD is probably gearing up for this issue to once again play a big role as a theme in the upcoming election, because it's kind of trying to position itself as the issue owner over that theme, compared to, yes, more left-leaning parties which want to talk about climate or nitrogen, as it were.
So you mentioned political scandals, and the former prime minister was known for his ability to avoid his reputation getting damaged as a result of these scandals. So and he decided to step down from politics as well. Do you think his party will miss him?
So, I mean, the party selected the current Minister of Justice, Dilan Yeşilgöz, as his successor. And in general, liberals were always really happy with her because she's a very clear communicator where it comes to issues of law and order and migration. So they really selected a candidate that fits their focus on the migration issue. To what extent they're going to miss this leader? Obviously, he's been prime minister for 13 years. He was a very important face of the Liberal Party, particularly in the last elections, which were really about his competence as a manager. So there, they might miss him, but I think more in general, Rutte represented a style of doing politics, a way of sort of continually finding new coalitions, finding new support, the ability to also not just be committed to a particular position, but also a willingness to trade. That is very important in sort of keeping a country of many different parties to find majorities there for legislation. And so I think that the ability of the system to come to consensus is very important, and that a leader like Rutte is necessary to do that. And they clearly now selected a leader that is much more outspoken and much more principled in the way, at least, that she has done politics, in the sense that she wants particular things to be realized. And so in many ways, it's a question whether the Liberal Party can play the same role as a consensus builder without Rutte in the future.
There was also some debate about what the VVD would look like after Rutte. For many, that was hard to imagine. He's the longest serving prime minister the Netherlands has had. So it's really a big change in terms of who's going to be steering the country, who's going to be at the lead. What it looks like in the polls now is that the VVD isn't actually suffering too much. Like initially, we thought when Rutte stepped down, there was a bit of a leadership vacuum and also some debate about who was going to take over this party. But interestingly, the party has managed to stay quite steady. And what it looks like, a little bit, having read the program and listening to the tone of the new leader, is that it's maybe tacking a little bit to the right, especially when it comes to migration, and also opening up the possibility for coalition with far right, which is something that under Rutte, after the adventure of 2010, no longer was a possibility.
Next, I wanted to go through some of the main contenders in this election. You've already mentioned some of them. And so I'm afraid we don't have enough time to discuss all the 17 parties currently represented in the House of Representatives. So let's just focus on some of them. So what about the parties that were part of the outgoing coalition government? Because I'm aware some of the more centrist parties of that government seem to be struggling a little bit at the moment in the polls.
Well, so basically all other parties except for the Liberal Party, which, as Leonie mentioned, is doing quite well in the polls. It's currently one of the three main parties in the polls, are doing worse. So that's the Christian Democrats, who are doing really poorly because they lost one of their most prominent members of parliament, who's now set up his own party, which I guess we'll discuss later as well. And so they're really doing poorly, although they've selected a new leader who has got a very interesting profile for the party. And they've clearly also decided in their course to become more centrist than they were previously. But in my view, sort of the loss of the leader is going to hurt that party. The loss of Omtzigt is going to hurt this party too much to really perform well in these elections. The other major party is the Social Liberal Party. They basically had a very simple history in the last year since their existence. That's when they govern, they would basically lose half their seats. That was a general rule in Dutch politics. They had one election before where that didn't happen. That was 1977. It was a very special election. And then in the last elections, 2021, even though they'd governed for 4 years, they then won those elections and actually became the second largest party. But now it looks like that everything that they won in that election, and even more, they're going to lose in this election. And that has got to do with the fact that the Social Democrats and Greens, who are working together, have selected a candidate prime minister who is very similar to their profile and is a very important competitor for them. The final party in the coalition is the ChristenUnie, which is a very peculiar Dutch party in the sense that there are not many sister parties around Europe, which combines more left-wing positions on the environment, migration, and social issues with more conservative positions on moral issues. And that party usually is very stable. So in the last elections, it always won 5 seats. And now these are the first elections where they're polling slightly below that. Whether that will be realized, we'd have to see that. But they are now seeing competition, in particular, from the new Christian Democratic Party by Omtzigt that I mentioned, but also from the Farmer Citizens Movement party that's very critical of environmental measures, where they've in general been very positive about. So that's the first time in years that they're seeing very strong electoral issues.
So let's talk about one of the new comers, this new social contract party that you mentioned before, that was created by one of the MPs of the Christian Democratic Party. What is this party about? What do they stand for, and where is its support coming from? Because it seems to be set to become one of the main parties after this election.
I can kick off with that. So it's a party that is led by Pieter Omtzigt, and he left the Christian Democratic Party over internal party clashes. And that's important for this conversation because he did not split off from the Christian Democrats because he had ideological disagreements. It was really for personnel and personal issues. And it's clear that Omtzigt's new party, the new social contract, is also still based on these Christian ideals. So in some ways, you see the death of Christian democracy in the Netherlands with the CDA hemorrhaging support, but now the reincarnation of Christian democracy with this new social contract party. We see the starting point of the party is personalism, which is primarily a Catholic philosophy that emerged in Europe between the two world wars. And the idea is basically that people, understood as persons, not individuals, are threatened by the state. And in the origin documents of the party, which was the only thing we had until this morning, because this morning was finally the moment where he presented his actual program, suggests that the party still has these Christian democratic fundamentals, although you cannot find any evidence of mention of the word God in there, but it's full with Christian values, Catholic virtues, communitarianism, and it actually seems to be combining socioeconomically left-leaning positions, so very, very critical of neoliberalism, even some sentences that are reminiscent of Marxism, really clearly anti-capitalist, but at the same time combining that with culturally more right-leaning issues. So lots of attention on family, community, identity, tradition, Dutch language, cultural identity is very important for the party. And also with regards to immigration, that's quite important. It wants to manage migration, different flows of migration. And today, this morning, we heard it wants to curb immigration by setting a number, which is 50,000 migrants per year.
So this combination of positions being socio-economically at least being center-left and culturally being conservative has been identified by political scientists already for years, sort of the ideal combination of positions. Because in that way, you have to realize that in the Netherlands, about 44% of the Dutch voters are conservative on migration, but left-leaning on economic issues. That's the largest group of voters, but there's no party that really positions itself right in the middle of that quarter. And there are parties that are close to it, but there's no party that really says, okay, this is our position. And so if we think about who votes for them, then that will be dominantly the voters coming from this area, which is quite underserved. And that means that they previously might have voted for the Social Democrats and then accepted that the Social Democrats were more progressive than them on cultural issues, but at least shared their economic values. And on the other side, Christian Democrats and liberals who previously voted, even radical right, who might have voted for parties that were culturally in line with them, but on economic issues were further to the right to them. And this sort of combination means that he has got an ideal position to do very well in the elections. Obviously, that will depend on strategy, campaign, communication, and leadership, but in many ways, he has an ideal position in terms of positions to do very well in the elections, combining cultural conservatism with economic left-wing positions. Now, I have to mention that the extent to which his manifesto is really left-wing is debated among political scientists. Obviously, if you think about the very classical left, a large role of the state, major redistribution, high taxes, he is in the end still a Christian democratic centrist politician, but clearly in his positioning focuses on how it's important that a welfare state is there for the worst off. But he isn't necessarily somebody who believes in big government. Rather, the personalist philosophy that Leonie just mentioned really emphasizes the importance of individuals separate from the government, and that there should be a room for people to develop themselves and for there to be a community outside of too much government interference. So he isn't far left, but he's clearly appealing to voters that are center left on economics and conservative on cultural issues.
And with that, it can play this bridge function, right? It can attract voters from the more left-leaning side of the spectrum and from the right-leaning side. And that puts it a bit in the sweet spot, as Simon mentioned, where it can play maybe a kingmaker role in the coalition agreements. But that's still a long time from now. And maybe one thing that is also important for this party is that one of its key issues is the new governance culture, bestuurscultuur as it's called. So he wants to set this on the agenda, the changing the relationship between the government. And he has also quite some technocratic ideas about how he wants to change the sort of governance system in the Netherlands.
That's extremely interesting. Now, there are several populist parties in the Dutch parliament, right? From the far left Socialist Party, which also seems to be struggling at the moment, to the far right. And we've got several parties. There is the Party for Freedom, Forum for Democracy, etc. But there is this party, this agrarian populist party, that became quite famous in March because it's called the Farmer Citizen Movement, right? And it emerged as the winner of the provincial elections. What happened to them? So is this one of those cases of a dog that didn't bark in the end?
Well, so what happened to them is Omtzigt happened to them. So in many ways, they were appealing to a very similar electorate, or their program wasn't very focused on economic issues. It's very strongly focused on environmental issues and agriculture. But the leader had the same appeal of being very conservative on cultural issues and having at least concern for the worst off in terms of their economic positioning. And that meant that when Omtzigt came around, that group of voters got a better alternative, namely a party with a leader that's more popular than the BBB. So that was a problem for the party. The second thing was that as migration became more important on the agenda, that the nitrogen issue really lost major attention. And that was their major sort of appeal to voters, their resistance to the measures taken in the Netherlands to restrict the nitrogen emissions, which would really come down to reducing the number of factory farms in the Netherlands, therefore at least the number of animals held there. And the last thing is that they made a lot of mistakes in the campaign. And I think the most important one is their leader was unwilling to become prime minister simply because she didn't want to, which is fine. I also don't want to become prime minister. And then they selected another politician to become prime minister who was less popular than her. And so in many ways, they made a very strange choice there, choosing somebody who voters at least see as less competent to become prime minister as their candidate to become prime minister. And it was one of a series of sort of curious choices that they made that didn't do their reputation very well. But I think in many ways, the reason they're now polling worse than they did previously is really the fact that they have this competitor in the form of Omtzigt.
But they're still not gone, right? They're still going to be making huge gains. I mean, the party has one seat at the moment in parliament. There are now some people who have defected from other parties to join her. And at least in the personnel, these are parties from the more radical right. So two from Ja21, so other radical right party, and one from the Wilders' PVV. So at least in personnel, it looks maybe a bit more right-leaning. But one of the big issues is, as Simon also alluded to, is that Caroline van der Plas, is unable to really differentiate herself from Omtzigt. There was even a situation in a TV debate where she was asked, well, why would voters vote for you instead of Omtzigt? What's the difference? And she wasn't able to answer that. She said, well, that's a good question. So she's now working, of course, on that to profile herself as someone who's a bit different. But yeah, she cannot only win the elections based on support from the farmers. And you see in the program that she's trying to broaden her appeal a bit. The word platteland has, so the countryside has left a bit for the word region. The word farmer has been substituted to some extent by the word citizen. And so you see she's really broadening her appeal a bit, but the extent which this might work will also depend on the extent to which nitrogen and farmers' issues will become a central topic in the election. And it doesn't really look like that yet at the moment.
And what is going on the left of the political spectrum? You mentioned before that there's a new coalition between the Social Democrats and the Greens. So how is it going for them? What is happening there?
So, I mean, in the Netherlands, we've talked about cooperation between the parties of the left for a long time. Basically, since the cooperation ended in the 1970s, parties have been talking about reviving some kind of cooperation between the Social Democrats on the one side and then the parties that currently are the Green left on the other side. And there was a lot of talk of that. And now, finally, sort of, the first time in years, there's really intensive cooperation between the two progressive parties. And their basic strategy is very simple. In the past, the Social Democrats have always been able to do very well in elections by making them a referendum on who will become prime minister. Basically, that is a way for, in the last weeks, to persuade voters that they need to vote for the Social Democrats instead of some of the smaller left-wing parties, because you want to have a Social Democratic prime minister instead of having a liberal or a Christian Democratic prime minister. And they're now basically repeating this strategy by they've selected Frans Timmermans, who is a former vice president of the European Commission, as their candidate as prime minister, and also their lead candidate, in the hope of sort of making this a referendum between, on the one side, candidates of the right, and him as the only credible candidate prime minister on the left. And the extent to which that is successful really depends on the dynamic that the current campaign will get. And in the Netherlands, campaigns are extremely short. So the real intensive period of the campaign will be the last 2 weeks. And in that period, voters can really make up their mind and make a final decision. So in the last elections, we saw that the social liberals, who were polling not very well a month before the elections, doubled in compared to their polling, because they had selected a leader who was in that case Kaag, who was also seen as a candidate for prime minister. And so that's what the Social Democrats and Greens are currently banking on, is that will be the dynamic in the campaign. That the question will be, do you want Jezilgus as a prime minister, or do you want Timmermans as a prime minister? But Omtzigt really changes the game, because, as Leonie mentioned, one of the focuses that he has is a different political culture, a culture where parliament is more prominent instead of the government. And that means that the dynamic could also become, do you want to vote for the challenger who introduces a new way of doing politics, and not for the traditional parties, the Social Democrats and the Liberals? And the question really, we're a month before the elections today, is whether that will actually happen, because we don't know yet what the dynamic will be, because that will be decided in the final 2 weeks.
And this coalition between the Labour Party and the Green Left Party, is good to mention, it's not a marriage of love necessarily, but also a marriage of necessity. They have been in free fall. I mean, the center-left in general in the Netherlands has been in free fall electorally for about 2 decades. And the combined vote share of these two parties was just around 40% still in the 1990s, and now around 10% in 2021. So if they really wanted to buck that trend, they had to really join forces. It was maybe their only realistic option they had. And it looks like, at least in the short term, in the polls, you see a bit of a modest bump in that they might be able to go over that 10% again together. But yeah, the extent to which that's actually gonna be the case will have to be seen. The Netherlands generally has center-right or right-wing coalition governments, and left-wing parties are structural minority in the Netherlands, and it's impossible numerically to form a purely left-leaning government.
Yeah. So where it comes to coalition formation, because it's sort of a natural step here, the ball is really with NSA. So they're going to be the ones that decide either whether they want to govern with the Liberals or with the Social Democrats and Greens. And so they have the position of kingmaker that traditionally in the Netherlands Christian Democrats have always had. They could either look towards the left and govern with the Social Democrats, or look towards the right and govern with the Liberals. And the fascinating thing is that Omtzigt so far has been unwilling to commit himself to either camp. He has stated in a recent debate that on economic issues, he feels closer to the Social Democrats and Greens, but on migration, he feels closer to the Liberals. Clearly sort of signaling that both parties will sort of have to come to him and offer him whatever he wants in order to enter government, that he will be the kingmaker, or even the potential prime minister, choosing a junior partner to join him, depending on the election results.
So from what you've been telling me, it looks like the new social contract party really changed the dynamic of the election. Is going to be to play a very key role after the election as well.
So I mean, there is an irony there that in the provincial elections we had a very similar dynamic with the farmer citizens movement, who then was the new kid on the block and sort of advocating for a new way of doing politics, and the Liberals, and then already a cooperation between the Social Democrats and the Greens. And so we basically now substituted that with NSA, who has a more credible story in terms of being a challenger, which also is not just limited to rural areas and more peripheral areas, but also appeals to basically larger layers of society. So that dynamic is consistent with how it was in the spring, but it's amped up because Omtzigt is a more popular politician with a more credible story about reform.
And there are 2 ways in which you can read this: either that it's completely new and different and a totally different election, or you can actually see, well, maybe it's the remnants of the old pillarization that's still coming back, right? There's still the 3 traditional party families in a new shape, but still those 3 party families that seem to be at the lead of these elections.
Yeah, and certainly in terms of coalition formation, we're basically going back to what we had in the Netherlands since the 1970s, when we had the big Christian Democratic Party that could either govern with the left or with the right, and it had a really dominant centrist position, dominating system. Actually, that goes back to even the post-Second World War period, where the Catholics had a similar position in the party system. But we're really going sort of back to a centrist party who can decide to govern with the left or with the right.
And so what are the main issues being discussed in this campaign? You talked about immigration before. Is this election primarily about immigration? Are there other issues that are being discussed?
I think that's the key question that's still up in the open. Which are the key topics that will dominate this election? I think the VVD has been banking on migration, also hoping in a way that that would become a big issue. Around this time of year, it usually is, because that's the time when migrants are arriving here. The boat migrants, that is, refugees. But it's still a bit open in the debate as to which topics. So the first TV debate was only this Sunday, meaning that parties are still trying to put their issues on the agenda. One thing that's been not very prominently visible in the debate, which I find interesting, is the issue of climate. So that's something that which you might imagine might be important, but doesn't really seem to be playing a big role. Interestingly, bestaanszekerheid, so this poverty reduction issue, is very prominent, also with rising energy prices and inflation. Even centrist and right parties are pushing, for instance, to up minimum wage. And in that sense, this topic might become a bit diffused politically, because all the parties seem to agree that that's important. Migration is, for the right, of course, important, and they're going to try to put that on the agenda. And then another topic that I think might play, or that Omtzigt really is trying to push, is this change of governance culture. I think these are the topics that I can see so far.
Yeah, so I think it's important to mention here, as political scientists, we're very inclined to think about themes and to think about that elections are about specific subjects. But we saw in the last elections, but also previously, that parties have an interest in not having very substantive campaigns, rather making the campaign about who do you want to become prime minister. In the last elections, it was Rutte, sort of as the Corona prime minister, very popular in that period. I mean, 2 years later, it's all changed. Very popular, sort of banking on his management style. And then Sigrid Kaag, his Minister of Development Cooperation and Foreign Trade, who also banked on saying, I will be a new kind of leader. And so you can see there that the Dutch elections, in the end, parties really want to make them a referendum about who you want to be governed by, instead of having very substantive debates. And Omtzigt actually has been the one who sort of challenged this, and also said in the run-up to the campaign that he wanted to have more substantive debates. On the other side, the irony is that an important part of Omtzigt's support is also his personal appeal. Namely, he's not necessarily a very charismatic politician, but he's seen as one of the only honest people in The Hague. A person who has exposed a major government scandal and has really focused on how people were mistreated by the government, and has always sort of tried to be an honest voice. And that means that in many ways, he can just put his face on the campaign poster and say, vote for me, without having necessarily a very substantive debate. So the irony is that Dutch campaigns are relatively short, and they're not necessarily terribly substantive. They can be very focused on the question, who do you trust? Who do you think will be a reliable prime minister? Who do you think will be a reliable politician?
And the irony is, like you say, Simon, that Omtzigt, who has been very critical of this, who has said elections should be about content and about themes, that he's the one who's now decided to put his face on the election poster, whereas the other parties chose not to do that. Not all of them, of course, but the other big parties like the VVD or Green Left, Labour Party coalition, they're not running on these personalist traits of the leaders, but Omtzigt is, and that's of course logical, because much of the attraction of his party is around his persona, because he's really seen as this watchdog who stands out for common citizens, who fights for what's just and right, who's a good opponent to the government, keeps the government in check. So he's really credited for his role as a parliamentarian.
And so my last question is about the volatility of Dutch politics. So we've seen very volatile elections in Western Europe in the past couple of decades, not just in the Netherlands, but the Netherlands keeps surprising us time and time again. Why is Dutch politics so volatile? And is it because Dutch voters get easily fed up with political parties, or is there something else going on here? You were suggesting before that maybe things are kind of in a way or another going back to the way in which they used to be in the past, with a central party that is always in government with different kinds of parties. What is going on at the moment? What do you think is happening in terms of why is everything so volatile, and are we going back to a different kind of situation where maybe things will become slightly less volatile in the future?
So I think that if you think about Dutch voting behavior, voters in the Netherlands don't have very strong party identification. Perhaps in the 1960s, in the pillarized period that Leonie mentioned, people felt really committed to a particular community, and to that community also belonged to a particular party. But as pillarization declined in the Netherlands, people no longer felt particularly committed to parties. That doesn't mean that they just float around the political spectrum as though they're completely loose, but they're more committed to, say, specific other identities. They might see themselves as left wing, they might see themselves as right wing, they might see themselves as conservative, they might see themselves as progressive, meaning that they can vote for different parties with that profile dependent on how those parties do. So in the last elections, we saw that the social liberal D66 party got a lot of voters who previously voted for the Social Democrats and for the Greens, by appealing to new leadership, the perspective of her becoming the next prime minister, the first female prime minister of the Netherlands. Now, those voters didn't necessarily feel that they betrayed the Greens or betrayed the Social Democrats. They chose a party that was programmatically very similar, but had a more realistic chance of becoming a major government party. And that was also, at that moment, sort of that momentum behind it, because different voters were amassing behind her. So that's the kind of mechanism that we see in the Netherlands, is that voters are committed to a particular bloc, not necessarily committed to a particular party. And depending on how parties do, depending on what kind of credible perspective they have of entering government, or what kind of credible perspective they have on being a critical actor, of saying, being a voice of opposition, that then persuades voters to vote for particular parties. And so I don't think necessarily that although the party system is very similar in sort of many ways to how it was previously, that we'll see sort of a rise in partisanship in the Netherlands. No, this situation of people being committed not as much to particular parties, but rather to particular areas in the political spectrum, is something that's very consistent. And the chances are significant that if, let's say, the Liberals enter in government with NSA, that then some of those parties who voted for NSA, some of the voters who voted for NSA might go to other parties soon, because they don't think that NSA has lived up to its promise, potentially. I mean, voters are committed to their own positions, not as much to particular parties.
Right. So it's a case of voters holding parties accountable within the same bloc. Is that what you're suggesting? Okay.
Yeah, so under this fragmentation and volatility, you have actually quite stable camps, center-right, center-left, and a far-right camp. In the previous election, at least, there were three big voting blocks, and voters switch within these blocks, but not so much between. That's kind of the big story.
Yeah, and so the special thing about NSA is that this is a party that appeals to these three different blocks. So it does well amongst people who used to vote for the Social Democrats but think that they've become too progressive. It is well amongst liberal people, voters who might have voted for the Christian Democrats and the Liberals, who want to have a more fair economic distribution. But it also does well amongst people who voted for the radical right and want change, where for instance, the Freedom Party has been blocked for government participation for so long.
And then we, of course, have lots of parties, right? That's also something we shouldn't forget to mention, that in the previous elections, 37 ran, and now it's only 24, so not as many this time. But of course, a very low electoral threshold, which means it's fairly easy for new parties to get in.
Yeah. All right, our time is up. Thank you very much, Leonie and Simon, for helping us better understand what's going on in the Netherlands at the moment. This has been such an amazing conversation, and I'm sure our listeners too, will be definitely paying a lot of attention to the outcome of this election on the 22nd of November. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.